Our entire lives we have been instilled with a simple and convenient version of the past, as if people of the 19th century, having barely mastered steam engines and primitive cranes, supposedly built gigantic palaces, temples, and government complexes themselves, comparable in scale to modern megacities. But if you are hearing my voice now, it means you are ready to learn what universities, academies of science, and archives closed to ordinary citizens prefer to keep silent about. You have been deceived, and this deception has been going on for over 2 centuries. What are historians hiding? Why do the planet's most grandiose structures look as if they were built by beings for whom our current construction standards are merely child's play? And most importantly, who actually left us these architectural traces? Imagine doors as tall as a 3-story house. Imagine columns that even modern engineers would not be able to install without highly complex mechanisms requiring computing technology and heavy machinery, which, according to official textbooks, simply did not exist in the 19th century. If you carefully look at the facades of the enormous buildings in former capitals, you will see traces of perfectly even stone carving, so precise that it resembles industrial laser processing. We are told that all of this was done by artisans manually with the help of a chisel and a simple wooden ladder. But ask yourself, could thousands of workers, whom official demography barely registers in those regions, have created such gigantic complexes within the timeframes that historians claim? Where are the calculations? Where are the documents on logistics? Where is even a hint of how they moved blocks weighing tens of tons through city streets that were not even paved at the time? There are no answers, and this is no accident. The deeper I studied old city plans, the more strongly I felt that we are facing a carefully hidden pause in history. As if in our past, someone pulled out a huge layer of knowledge and then inserted a convenient version. As if all this grandiose architecture appeared naturally, step by step. But even a school mathematics course shows official population statistics simply don't add up. For example, in the mid-19th century, many regions of Europe had a population smaller than a large modern metropolitan district. Yet these same regions somehow built grandiose railway stations, cathedrals, government buildings with gigantic domes, and highly complex sewage systems. Something here clearly doesn't add up. I found archival data according to which the construction of some objects supposedly took only a few years. But to move even one stone slab weighing tens of tons, a modern construction company uses powerful cranes, entire brigades of specialists, and complex calculations. And this is with the availability of computers. Compare this with 19th century workers who, if official history is to be believed, lived in wooden houses, suffered from a lack of tools, widespread illiteracy, and elementary diseases. How then could they create architecture that we still cannot replicate? Why does no one ask this question publicly? I searched for an explanation and came to a conclusion that sends shivers down my spine. The official version of history was created so that we would never know who possessed technologies capable of erecting multi-ton structures as if they were ordinary toys. We are observing traces of a civilization that either vanished as a result of a global catastrophe or was intentionally destroyed. And the most frightening thing is, the deeper I dig, the more obvious it becomes that we have been placed in the position of those who should only admire, but not ask questions. And all of this leads to the main point. If people of the 19th century could not build such architecture, then who could? When you start comparing official data with what can be seen with your own eyes, a feeling arises as if an enormous chessboard lies before us, on which someone has arranged the pieces retrospectively. I look at the gigantic colonnades of former capitals, at palaces with ceilings 3 and sometimes 4 human heights tall, at stone blocks that today would have to be transported by special machines, and I see one thing. this is not the scale of the 19th century human hand. This is the scale of a civilization for whom such structures were the norm, and we simply inherited them, like children who found an abandoned fortress in the forest and decided they built it themselves. Consider this. We are told that many of the most complex buildings were constructed in 10, sometimes 15 years. But let's take a simple example. A modern construction company, with access to computer modeling, steel cranes, concrete plants, and lifting platforms, erects a large, medium-sized administrative building in approximately 5 to 7 years. But this involves concrete, light metal structures, prefabricated blocks, and standardized elements. Now imagine the 19th century, where there were no electric motors, no construction elevators, no metal frame structures, no welding. And yet, we are asked to believe that gigantic structures with dozens of columns, marble statues, and domes were built in similar time frames, and sometimes even faster. How? Historians' answer sounds almost derisive. Mass labor. But let's check the math. In several regions of Europe in the mid-19th century, the urban population barely reached a few tens of thousands of people. Now let's assume that a significant portion of these people was involved in construction. Who then grew grain? Who engaged in crafts? Who conducted trade? Who built roads? Who maintained cities? And most importantly, who could possibly be a specialist in stone carving? After all, to carve a perfectly straight column, decades of experience and high-quality metal tools, which were rare, are needed. Official demography dissipates like smoke. One only needs to ask a couple of uncomfortable questions. And now let's move on to what I call the mathematical traces of a past civilization. Studying the plans of old cities, I noticed recurring proportions that correspond not to the capabilities of 19th century builders, but to a clear system based on unified standards. This system used identical distances between columns, identical facade angles, identical heights of entrance portals. Such a thing is only possible with a centralized engineering school, and a school far more ancient and developed than the one that emerged during the era of industrialization. Imagine a network of architects and engineers possessing technologies that allow multi-ton structures to be moved with millimeter precision. Where are their traces? Where are the textbooks? Where are the tools? Why has none of this survived? And instead we receive a legend that everything was built literally by the hands of peasants who had just moved to the cities. But the most striking manifestation of the mystery is the discrepancy between the technological level of construction and the everyday life level of that era. How is it possible that a people who still walked in wooden shoes created architecture surpassing the capabilities of the 21st century? Compare ancient palaces, whose walls are made of stone several human heights thick, with the buildings of modern ministers, where even the cladding often falls off after 10 years. Why, if the 19th century possessed such technologies, do we not see them anywhere else? Why did a sharp decline occur? Why, after the supposedly golden age of construction, does a period suddenly arrive when we can barely maintain in working order what we inherited? It resembles a scenario where we arrived too late, when the true creators had already vanished, leaving behind gigantic stone shells, and all that was left to us were inscriptions, documents, and legends, which were recorded only after the civilization collapsed. So who built all of this? And why are the traces of this power so carefully hidden to this day? The deeper I delved into old archives, the clearer it became. Official history seems to deliberately avoid a direct comparison of dates, technologies, and demographics. Too many inconsistencies, too many miracles where simple logic should prevail. But the most interesting part began when I stumbled upon industrial statistics from the late 19th century. It indicated that the production of steel, brick, and cement in some regions was so negligible that it would barely suffice for the construction of a couple of blocks in a modern city. And yet, we are told that precisely during this period, gigantic cathedrals, multi-story administrative centers, bridges hundreds of meters long, and palaces whose area surpassed entire villages were being erected. This is not just an error. This indicates that the very foundation of chronology was adjusted to fit a convenient version. I drew attention to a strange phenomenon that few people talk about. Old buildings look as if they were not built, but carved from solid masses. Pay attention to the facades of some former capitals. The stone walls run in perfectly straight lines, without visible traces of primitive masonry, without the characteristic errors of human labor. The wall masses seem to be stretched in a single rhythm, as if they were created not with bricks, but by some more advanced method. But what method? We are told. They used a huge number of workers who knew how to work professionally. Okay, but then where are these workers? Why are there no records of gigantic construction barracks, of specialized schools for stone carvers, of the production of metal tools on the necessary scale? Why do we see tens of thousands of pages about how peasants lived in log cabins, but practically nothing about the people who, supposedly, erected the architectural wonders of the planet? And now consider another fact. Many gigantic buildings of the 19th century were already partially ruined in that era. In old photographs, we see traces of melting, collapses, columns lying on the ground, as if the buildings had endured not construction, but a catastrophe. How does official history explain this? Construction error, natural wear and tear, ground problems. But why then is wear and tear observed only in old monumental structures, and not in primitive wooden buildings of the same era? Why did the most complex domes crack, while the shacks around them stood intact? This resembles traces of a shock wave, high temperature, or other destructive impact. And if these are indeed traces of a catastrophe, then these buildings existed long before they were attributed to the 19th century. Now about demographics. According to official data, the population of large cities increased several-fold, literally within 1 or 2 decades. But how is this possible if, during the same period, there were epidemics, famine, mass migration, and a lack of medicine? Moreover, cities seemed to be designed for a much larger number of inhabitants than they actually had. Wide streets, gigantic squares, enormous basements and halls, which, according to historians, were built for small societies of artisans and officials. But why then such a scale? Why is the architecture designed for tens of thousands of people simultaneously if the population at the time of construction was many times smaller? All of this looks more like the remaining set pieces of a past civilization, whose population was far more numerous, technologically advanced, and organized than we are accustomed to thinking. And the more I compared the figures, the clearer it became. The gap between reality and the official version is enormous. This is not a mistake. These are traces of history being rewritten. The most striking discovery, however, completely overturned my understanding of what was happening. I stumbled upon documents according to which many old buildings were not built, but restored. Yes, that's exactly how they are recorded in reports: restoration, reconstruction, bringing into usable condition. But how can something that has just been built be restored? This can only mean one thing. These gigantic structures existed long before our supposed time and were simply adapted to a new reality. So the main question arises: where did the creators of these structures disappear? And who today is making efforts to ensure that we never connect all these dots? I continued to collect the scattered pieces of this enormous mosaic, and the picture became increasingly disturbing. The further I delved, the more strongly I felt that all of our history resembles a vast archive where half the pages have been torn out and the remaining ones rewritten to conceal a key truth. And this feeling intensified when I compared data on climate, migrations, and the sudden demographic shifts of the late 18th and 19th centuries. It turned out that many regions of the Earth experienced a sharp decrease in population within literally a single generation. But instead of explaining the reasons, historians confine themselves to general phrases: diseases, wars, economic difficulties. However, if one carefully studies the documents of this period, it becomes evident no ordinary processes could have led to such a scale of human disappearance. This resembles the consequences of a global catastrophe, the traces of which are today carefully masked as natural changes. Compare old photographs with modern ones, you will notice a strange detail. Most old buildings appear to be buried in the ground. The lower floors were found to be under a meter-thick layer of soil. We are told this is due to natural soil accumulation. But why then did only monumental stone buildings suffer from this accumulation, while later structures nearby did not? I found dozens of photographs showing that the first floors of old structures had sunk almost completely underground, as if the city at some point was covered by a gigantic wave of mud or sediment. But not a single textbook mentions this. Why? Because such a catastrophic scenario completely shatters the idea of a continuous, calm development of human civilization. It clearly demonstrates between us and the creators of this gigantic architecture lies an abyss filled with an unknown tragedy. And the more I studied old structures, the clearer another frightening thought became. The scale of the buildings clearly does not correspond to human proportions. Entrances 2 human heights tall, staircases where an ordinary person feels like a child. Enormous corridors, halls with acoustics designed for voices of incredible power. For whom was all this created? For the small population of the 19th century? For officials who were educated in wooden schools? For peasants who were barely literate? Obviously not. These structures were intended for those who were significantly more numerous, technologically more advanced, and possessed a different way of life. It's as if today we live inside architectural suits not tailored for us. And now let's move on to what I call shocking bites. There are documents that indicated data on the number of stone blocks used for the construction of certain objects. And here's what's striking. In some cases, the volumes of material exceed what the region could physically produce in several decades. To process such an amount of stone manually would require hundreds of thousands of stonecutters who simply could not have existed. There weren't enough people. This means either technologies existed that allowed stone to be processed in volumes inaccessible to the 19th century, or the materials were delivered or processed even before that era. In both cases, the official version crumbles. But the most interesting thing is the sharp technological reset that occurs several decades later. As if someone needed people to lose the skills and knowledge that allowed such structures to be erected. Gigantic buildings suddenly stopped being built. Architecture sharply simplified. Thin walls, cheap materials, rapid construction appear. No more stone giants emerge. Why? What happened? Where are those masters who, according to textbooks, created wonders? Why did their schools, methods, and tools disappear without a trace? It feels as though we witnessed a civilizational rollback, as if someone pressed a reset button and erased everything that would remind us of the former power. And now, another fact that people prefer to keep silent about. In several 19th century documents, a strange phrasing appears. Buildings adapted to new requirements. Adapted? To what requirements exactly? If the buildings were recently built, why adapt them? This is a direct indication that they already existed but required adaptation to a different culture, different city sizes, different people. Imagine, you find a gigantic fortress and turn it into a government building. This is precisely what was happening everywhere. We are not the builders. We are the inheritors of ruins. And when you put it all together, demographic failures, traces of catastrophe, gigantic scales, impossible technologies, absence of tools, and most importantly, the sharp loss of architectural power, it becomes obvious official history hides the traces of a civilization that disappeared almost instantaneously. But it did not disappear completely. The traces of its construction stand right before us. We just got used to ignoring them, Oring. And then a question arises that sends a chill down my spine. If this civilization disappeared, what exactly destroyed it? And most importantly, could it happen again? The closer I got to the final point of my investigation, the clearer I felt. We live on the remnants of a world that we are not even allowed to contemplate. The gigantic architectural complexes attributed to the people of the 19th century are not just a heritage. They are traces of another era, other technologies, and perhaps another civilization that vanished so quickly, as if it was swept off the face of the earth in a single blow. And when I tried to trace this moment of disappearance, I discovered a strange thing. It's as if there's a gap in history, a void 1 or 2 generations long. Such a period is never mentioned directly, but it is noticeable in statistics, in demography, in architecture, and even in the literature of that time. As if something so massive happened between the 18th and 19th centuries that its consequences are still hidden under a layer of the official version. Try to look at this without prejudice. At some point, a civilization existed on the planet capable of erecting enormous stone structures, working with monoliths, using material processing technologies unavailable even to us today. Then, a sharp collapse. Ruined buildings, streets covered with soil, a vanished population, reset technologies, and a few decades later, a sudden growth of cities, an influx of people, the beginning of the industrial age. But who were these people? Where did they come from? Why did they occupy cities clearly not built for them? In old photographs from the late 19th century, one thing stands out: an incredible emptiness. Enormous city squares without crowds. Gigantic buildings with a few random people nearby, as if the scale of the architecture and the scale of the population do not correspond to each other. Where are the hundreds of thousands of inhabitants if cities supposedly grew at rapid rates? Why do we see empty streets in photos, structures without signs of activity, huge bridges without traffic? It's as if these cities were already ready, but not yet inhabited. And this completely changes the picture. We were taught that cities grew gradually, but the pictures show the opposite, as if a civilization was resettled into already prepared scenery. And here arises the most frightening thought. Perhaps the former civilization disappeared suddenly, and its place was quickly taken by new population groups who mastered the remaining infrastructure but could not replicate it. That is why the building technologies for gigantic monumental structures were not merely forgotten. They were unattainable for the new inhabitants. They lived in a world where walls were thicker than their ancestors' homes, where doors were taller than their height, where halls resembled temples intended for a different people. They did not build, they adapted. And this explains the sharp technological simplification. The new people simply did not know how to reproduce what they had inherited. But then the main question arises: what destroyed the former creators? I found dozens of hints of a catastrophe that could have been global. Some documents describe strange phenomena: gigantic fires without apparent cause, cities covered by meter-thick layers of sediment, mass deaths of the population, sharp climatic shifts. All of this resembles traces of an event that official history prefers to call local incidents, although the scale is more reminiscent of a global catastrophe. It probably caused the disappearance of those who possessed technologies inaccessible to us. And what survived became the basis for a new, artificially constructed chronology. And now we come to the most unpleasant part. If this truth has been hidden for over 100 years, then there is a reason for it. The destruction of old knowledge, the rewriting of history, the creation of a new chronology, all of this does not seem like a natural process. It resembles an operation to reset civilization. Imagine, the world is cleansed of former knowledge, former technologies, former people. A new era begins, where the population is introduced to a new reality, explaining that everything around them is their merit, their history, their achievements. But in reality, they live in the shadow of a past world. And here arises the last question, which cannot be avoided. If someone has already reset civilization once, what prevents them from doing it again? The gigantic architecture around us is a reminder that history can be rewritten at any moment, that we are merely temporary inhabitants of a world created by others, and that the grandiose entities of the past can return or disappear as suddenly as the current civilization appeared. And then everything takes on new meaning. We are not just investigating a mystery. We are trying to understand at what stage of a huge cycle we currently stand. Was the 19th century the beginning of a new era? Or was it just another substitution, another layer, concealing the true past? What happens next? Who controls history? And most importantly, are we ready to learn the answers, if they turn out to be far more terrifying than the lies in textbooks?